Hello, graduate students of History of Sexuality. This is Professor Bowen here. As you know, over the course of the semester, each of you is going to lead a seminar discussion on one of the 7 different historical monographs we'll be reading together in this class. In our first seminar, we'll be discussing Véronique Mottier's Sexuality, a very short introduction, which was published in 2008 by Oxford University Press. As no one has signed up to lead this discussion, I thought I would take on this responsibility myself and use this presentation as an opportunity to model the kinds of things I'd like you to do when it becomes your turn to head up a seminar discussion. So, in what follows, please be sure to take note of how I've structured this video. Feel free to use it as a template for your own presentation. And of course, please do respond to the questions about Mottier's book that I'm going to get into in just a little bit. But before we get to that, let's get to know our author. Veronique Mattier is currently a professor of sociology at the University of Lausanne, where she's worked since 2006. Before that, she was a lecturer in political theory at the University of Geneva. Her training is in both political science and sociology. She received a BA in both subjects at the University of Geneva before getting a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge in 1998. Over the course of her career, Mattier has published numerous books and articles, most of which deal with sexuality, gender, and feminist theory and politics. Looking at the titles of some of the pieces she's authored, it's clear that much of her research is historical in nature, and that she's interested in examining changes in the relationship between sexuality and medicine, social policy, and citizenship over the course of the 20th century. The geographical locus of her work is Western Europe and Central Europe. Her earliest writings focused on the history of eugenics in Switzerland and include such publications as those you see here listed on the screen. More recently, she has become interested in medicine and medical topics. In 2014, she won a grant from the University of Lausanne for a project called Manufacturing Heterosexuality, the History of Female Desire Disorders in Switzerland since the 1960s. That project has resulted in a couple different research outputs, including her most recent piece, which is called The DSM-5 as Political Battleground, Gender Identities, Sexual Norms, and Female Desire. As I said before, the text that we're considering today was published in 2008. As part of Oxford University's very short introduction series, it's a good volume to begin our seminars with because it doesn't assume any prior knowledge of sexuality on the reader's part. So, if this is the very first book on the subject you've ever encountered, no worries. Mottier's text is an example of what we call synthetic scholarship, which is to say that instead of a monograph based on extensive archival and original primary source research, what she's done is provide a broad overview of her topic by synthesizing much of the existing secondary literature. If you flip toward the end of the book to the section called References and Further Reading, you can get a good sense of who exactly Mattier is drawing on here. Not surprisingly, she pulls information from a lot of her own published pieces, particularly the chapter called The State in the Bedroom, which focuses on eugenics. But the other texts her account derives from indicate that Mattier is an incredibly well-read scholar, someone who is familiar not just with the classic canonical texts in the field, like Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, Thomas Lacour's Making Sex, and Anthony Giddens' The Transformation of Intimacy. Note here, Anthony Giddens was her PhD supervisor. It's clear from the Notes and References section that Mattier is also familiar with much more recent books, from Helen King's Hippocrates' Woman, to Gunnar Broberg's Eugenics and the Welfare State, to Angus MacLaren's Impotence, A Cultural History, and Jonathan Ned Cots's The Invention of Heterosexuality from 2007. Not surprisingly, a lot of the secondary literature discussed here overlaps with Mottier's own interests, but it's also quite impressive that she has taken the time to master topics and literatures that are far from her own area of expertise, as can be seen, for example, in her citation of books like Rebecca Fleming's Medicine and the Making of Roman Women, Gender, Nature, and Authority from Celsus to Galen from 2000. Looking through the references and further reading section, we can actually learn quite a lot about the contents of the book, even before we start reading any of its chapters. This is actually where I'd advise you begin your journey into the text, and it also serves as the inspiration for the first questions I'd like to ask all of you. These are actually multi-part questions, so feel free to address any of what follows. As we scan through this part of the book, I'm wondering, what does Mottier's bibliography tell us about its contents? What can we learn about the chronological and geographical scope of the work from this section of the text, and about the specific topics Mottier explores in each chapter? After we've got a good sense of these things, I'd like us to move on to some more evaluative questions. For example, what do we think about the range of time periods, places, and topics she's chosen to include in this book? Does the bibliography suggest that we're getting a broad, comprehensive overview of the topic, or has Mottier left out some things that should be covered in an introductory text on sexuality? And if you were writing this kind of book, what would your bibliography look like in terms of secondary sources? Would you agree with Anthony Giddens, whose blurb on the back cover of the book declares that, quote, "This should become a standard text for courses on sexuality all over the world"? In addition to the references section, another place we can go to learn a lot about this book, again, without reading any of its chapters, is the index. While often neglected, indices are wellsprings of information about any book, particularly when it comes to figuring out their major themes. Indeed, there's a good reason that indexers are so highly sought after, and that the best of these make pretty good money. While an index won't give you an author's thesis, it will give you a sense of the concerns that are uppermost in their minds. At the same time, indices give us really valuable information about the connective ties that bind individual chapters together. If we see, for example, that a given entry is covered on pages that span the entirety of the text, we'll know something about how the author is trying to develop their argument from one chapter to the next. Looking at the index for this book, for example, we can see that Mottier has an awful lot to say about things like lesbianism, marriage, morality, and feminism. Compared to these topics, she is less concerned with things like transsexuality, colonialism, and mental illness. I'd like to know what you make of Mottier's index, and I have some questions related to it, including, what does this tell us, again, about the scope of the book? Do you think Mottier has covered all of the essential people, places, events, organizations, etc. that should go into an introductory text on sexuality, or, again, is she leaving some important things out? And lastly, again, if you were writing a book like this, what would your index look like? At this point, we're ready to return to the beginning of the text and start making our way through it chapter by chapter. But before doing this, one last thing I want to cover is the table of contents. From this, we can see that the book has 5 core chapters, and that these move forward chronologically, beginning with Before Sexuality, chapter 1, and then proceeding to The Invention of Sexuality, chapter 2, before concluding with The Future of Sex, chapter 5. Looking at these chapter titles, we know that right away this is an historical introduction to sexuality, and that Mottier is going to tell us something about how sexuality changed over time, probably, as the references and index suggest, starting in ancient Greece and ending somewhere near the present. The other two chapters, Virgins or Whores, Feminist Critiques of Sexuality, Chapter 3, and The State in the Bedroom, Chapter 4, appear to be more topical in nature, but they probably also carry forward the historical narrative Mattier is laying out for us. One thing that we can notice here, just by looking at the chapter titles, is that, not surprisingly, Mattier uses the word sexuality quite frequently. This could alert us to an important question. How does she define sexuality? What does she think it consists of? Along with this, we could ask, also again just on the basis of the chapter titles, does Mattier seem more like an essentialist or a constructionist? And how might we know this? And lastly, what might the theoretical underpinnings of the work be? And how do you think this might influence her overall narrative? Next, let's move on to the introduction. Though we might be tempted to skip over this short 2-page chapter, introductions are incredibly important parts of any book. Indeed, they are the single most important chapter in any text because they give us a sense of what the author is trying to achieve, why they wanted to write the book in the first place. The introduction is the best place to learn about the author's primary research question, the way they went about trying to answer that question, and what their key findings are. It is in the introduction that an author will give us the clearest articulation of their thesis statement, which is the major argument they're going to develop over the course of the book. So, what do we learn from Mattier's intro chapter? What is she trying to figure out here? What's the key question that drove her research? And also, how did she answer this? What's the key argument of the text? And how is Mattier going to try to convince us that her thesis is valid? Now, because I'm running a bit short on time here, I'm not going to walk through the body of the text with you. Instead, I'd like to give you some general questions to ponder and ask you to answer these by way of reference to evidence contained within the book's core chapters. In the discussion board, we can talk in a lot more detail about the contents of these chapters, but as we do this, I want to keep our attention on larger, big picture questions. And so, please use the following as a guide to help you get through the individual chapters. By the time you're done with the entire book, you should be in a pretty good position to answer the following. And I have 3 big picture questions for us, along with some follow-ups. The first is, how have social understandings of sexuality changed from antiquity to the present? And what have the sources of those changes been? As a follow-up, ask yourself, how convincing are Mattier's answers to these questions? Second big picture question. How is Mattier looking at sexuality, and what can we learn from her approach about how to do research on this topic? In terms of methodological frameworks, theoretical tools, and the kinds of sources she's making use of, what do you see as the major strengths and weaknesses of the work? And, as a follow-up to that, think about this. If you were going to write a book like this, how different would your own approach be? Third and final big picture question. How does Mattier's account of sexuality compare to others we've read so far this semester? Where would you place her within the field of sexuality studies? And how might you situate this particular text within the broader historiography on the topic? And again, as a follow-up, how successfully does Mattier move discussions about the history of sexuality forward? Is she breaking new ground here, or does the book fail to make an original contribution to the field? In the discussion board, please feel free to answer any of these questions that I've mentioned in previous slides. I'm trying to give you a range of things to talk about here, and I'm not requiring that each of you address all of these individually. My hope is that if some of us focus on certain questions and others on different ones, then by the end of the week we'll have a pretty good grasp on the text as a whole. So, having said all of that, let's get the conversation going. I'll see you all in the discussion board. Bye-bye for now.